Okay, it looks like we're live. Welcome everyone to The Blend, CX where we're talking about everything in between. We strongly believe that the employee experiences dictate the customer experiences. And we're really here to just talk about everything relative to that, industry updates, whatever it might be. I am Fran Brisky. I'm the founder and CEO of Hark, which is a channel that allows customers to get in touch easily through video and audio communication. Helping brands on the back end as well, but we're not here to talk about that. The first episode of The Blend is really focused on the Freshly crew, and we're missing one. Colin Crowley is also going to be joining us. Classic, his flight was canceled, and then he was on a standby list or something. Somehow he's getting home, and he's going to join us soon. But I'm going to hand it over to Ben and Dan to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their impact in the industry, and also what is your superhero as it relates to CX, your superpower?
Yeah, Dan, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, as mentioned, my name is Dan. I am a long-time CX professional. I've been doing this for 20 plus years. Although this is not what I started out thinking I was going to do. I went to school, thought ultimately I wanted to be a teacher, realized that was not going to be it for me. Got into some of the contact center space pretty early on, and realized that this was something that I liked to do, which was not expected at all. Found my way into some leadership roles. I've really loved it ever since then. And I had tons of crazy opportunities, lots of fantastic jobs, met a lot of great people, obviously Ben being one of them, Colin, of course. But it's been a journey that was super unexpected.
What made you,
real quick, we didn't get the superpower.
What is the superpower, and what made you realize you didn't want to become a teacher?
Oh, what made me realize the biggest thing that made me realize I didn't want to become a teacher was the fact that I didn't like children.
Good.
So somehow I'm mid 40s now, and I don't have any children. I have 2 fur kids, but that's it. In terms of what my superpower is, I would say my CX superpower is an uncanny ability to build relationships. I think that's one of the things that. It's kind of that unexpected thing that thing I didn't know that I was going to have to do, right? Like you knew you were going to have to be looking at charts, understanding data, and all these other kinds of things like that. But just trying to negotiate, even getting a laptop set up for someone is one of those things that is just like, oh my gosh, this shouldn't be this difficult, but here we are. So.
I love that. How do I follow it? I don't know. So my name is Ben. I am the Senior Director of CX at a company called Pair Eyewear. We do really cool glasses where you can change your tops and they do this fun thing, which is super exciting. Prior to that, I worked in sports entertainment for over a decade with a bunch of different companies like the Yankees, the Mets, Patriots, Bruins, MSG, Barclays Center, all leading up to this wonderful ride that I took with Dan at Freshly, where we were together for 4.5 years. I don't know if Dan knows, but I had originally applied for the job at Freshly when it was a CX manager role, and wound up not taking it, staying where I was staying. And when I came back, I found out that they had hired this guy, Dan, and that if I wanted to take this incredible ride at Freshly, I was going to have to do so under his command. And then I saw Dan, and I was like, okay, I'll take that ride, and I'll be second to Dan. I'll take it. And then we did that together for 4.5 years, and still to this day, one of the coolest things, maybe the coolest thing I've ever gotten a chance to do, is build that, and I can't wait to talk about it here today. My superpower, I think, is that I didn't come into that as like a contact center guy. I didn't know the world of ticketing and calls, chats, emails. And I still like to sort of wear that hat, that I'm more of an in-person, like at the venue CX guy. Like I know how to deal with people in person. And I am continuously trying to translate that to calls, chats, and emails. And I think that is a unique way to look at a contact center, and really drives at getting the customers what they want and making them as happy as possible. Because when you're in person, you have no choice, right? You can't put them on hold. You have to deal with it right there, live and in the moment. And I try to bring that over. So I would say that's my secret superpower.
Amazing. I just realized as we're going, I put the wrong link in the LinkedIn event. So that's good. I'm going to update that now. People should start flooding in. Good start. That's great. So if you don't mind backing up, like you both, like you said, Ben, you applied for a certain role. You both started around the same time. Mm-hmm. How did you develop and form that relationship and kick it off the right way for a successful outcome, obviously, that Freshly had?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll give it to Dan here too in a second. From my point of view, I had been talking with Colin for some time. There were, fits and starts on whether I was coming or not coming. It was a heck of a risk at that point. The CX team was about 12 people. The company was less than 100 people. There was no guarantee that it was going to exist in the near future. There were other companies out there doing similar things. I remember the day in the office when like Maple and Sprig closed, and it was like we could have been one of those that didn't make it. So finally took that chance, popped over, and Dan is there as CX manager, and he's based out in Arizona, and he's going to fly to New York for this like intense period of training where we're going to do this thing together. And I think that the relationship that we built in that 2 weeks, and Dan can tell me if I'm wrong, but that really set the foundation for what wound up being this heck of a ride over 4.5, 5 years. And even though he was in Arizona and I was in New York, we had built a strong enough relationship in that time together. We had to meet with the whole team and sit in these small rooms and tell our backstory 15 times. And so even though we were talking to different people each time, I had to hear Dan say his backstory like every one of those times, and he had to do the same for me. So I think Colin knew that too, and he forced us into that situation. And so we became best friends really, really quickly. And that sort of set the stage for the ride we took, even though we were on different coasts. Dan, tell me I'm wrong.
No. Well, so I'm a professional level introvert, right? And when we were getting ready to start the position, like 3 days before, or a couple of days before, I get a LinkedIn invitation from Ben. And I'm like, who is this guy? Like, why is he already trying to friend me on LinkedIn? Like, what is this about? I don't even know him. No, I'm not doing this. I remember even talking to my partner about that. I was like, I'm not doing this. I don't know this guy. And so I get there. We're sitting. I think we're it's like the first day of school, really. We're forced to sit next to each other in these little desks, and like I think he was already there, and it was like he was already comfortable, right? And I think that's just the Ben kind of thing to do, is just be comfortable wherever you are, no matter what you're doing. And it didn't take long before he broke down my introvert wall. Like it was like almost instant, right? And he has just this ability, or just this way about him that he is able to like kind of disarm you in that way, right? And that's not a bad thing. I think it's a brilliant thing. And, you were talking about how you didn't have any of the CX experience and anything like that. It was never an issue. It was never a challenge. It was never something that came up as like, oh, Ben, you don't know about contact centers, so you can't chime in here, right? Because the expertise that you did bring was far beyond what I was expecting initially, and then came to expect as the time went by, right? But we kind of forged that bond very early on, again, being kind of forced into this situation. We went on several mandates, which, if you're not familiar, mandates is where a couple of dudes go and they hang out and they do dude things, whatever those things are. One of the things that we did that I'm still not sure if we lose our man cards for this or not is we whispered to each other in the whispering wall in is that Grand
Central? Yes, we did. Yep.
And so
for those who don't know, Fran, I guess we have to do this now. In Grand Central, there is a tiled dome roof that makes it so that if you stand in one corner of the room and someone stands in the other corner of the room facing away from each other and you speak into it, the other person will hear it. The sound will travel across the roof. And so you see a lot of touristy people doing it. I took Dan there, and there's the two guys standing across the room, whispering to each other. Sweet nothings.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Classic touristy thing to do. But it's an interesting point you bring up, Dan. So Ben came in without that contact center experience, and like, how did you see that really help? Because CX is interesting, where the technology has evolved a lot over time. There's always new products out. There's always new streamlined ways to do things, and customers want to engage in different ways. So was it interesting to see somebody think more outside the box, and how did he push you and the team in doing so?
Yeah, I think that's the primary thing I was about to say, is that he didn't come in with a preconceived notion of what should be, right? And I think that's what helped make us do things just that bit differently, right? And I'm not going to lie and say that it was always fun and easy and all that kind of stuff like that. I think there were times where I was challenged at the point where I was like, I don't know about this, but right, we tried to do some of these things because they were, and I don't necessarily love that phrase outside the box, but they weren't the norm, right? They weren't what everybody was doing. And so we did just some different outreach things that we were trying, right? And some different ways that we were receiving the message and how we were responding to messages, right? It wasn't the whole cookie cutter type experience. And so just having that completely different perspective, I think was probably the most beneficial thing that we had in that particular situation.
Yeah, and that challenging internally within the team in a respectful manner. I know from past experience on my side, when things get really hard, that's what makes a team really close and respond the right way versus silo out. So I've worked with Ben for a while too, and I know he's got a good way of making people come together and respond the right way, and that's probably most paramount in the CX world. So I hear you. That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I think the other cool thing is that like Colin never made it like he was the be all end all, right? And I know he'll be joining us soon, and I think this is an opportunity for us to kind of talk him up a little bit. But he was always curious to hear what thoughts we had, and if we could iterate on some of those thoughts, all those types of things. There was never like this hierarchy where it felt like, okay, Colin's way or nothing, right? And it gave us a lot of freedom to do some of the things that we did. And I think it is ultimately what made us as successful as we were.
Yeah.
He's actually joined now. Right before I let him in, I'll let you two kind of go off before I admit him. But how did he, obviously he's that barrier between leadership in a way, right? Like he's communicating what he's hearing on his side and he's communicating upwards as well. How did he shield you from that to let you run a best-in-class organization?
There's a lot I could say on that. So I love Mike Weistrack still to this day. He was the CEO and founder of Freshly, but he is a very big personality. He would tell you this himself. And I think, and Colin's popping in here, the fact that we didn't really interact with Mike all that much or hear any of the stuff that some of the other teams had to deal with, I know is because Colin was taking all that fire, right? So he was going and having those one-on-ones with him, and he was dealing with the crazy screaming, yelling, what's going on, what's happening. And Colin would sort of deflect that fire from us, and we never had to really deal with it at all. And we were able to really build great things and build an incredible team, more importantly than anything else. And I give Colin all the credit for that, for sure.
Yeah, the way Colin was able to filter the message. When it got to us, there was it was a very obvious path that we had, right? And to go forward, right? We had to make our own way, right? But we knew what needed to be ultimately taken care of. So it was a filtering unlike any other. And I've tried to emulate that since then because it was very impressive. And I don't know that I'm necessarily remotely as skilled as he was with the filtering of that, but I think it's what ultimately helped to get in any messaging that was coming to us that made sense, right? It made sense, was actionable, and things that we could actually affect.
So you both started, where was Freshly when you started? Was it taking off pretty rapidly?
So at that point, I always forget the number, but I think we were in the 80s. So whether Dan was 84, I was 85, something like that. We were in those number of employees, and I believe that included the kitchen as well. And the kitchen was one small kitchen in Phoenix, Arizona, with one grill. That all the steaks and chickens were being cooked on that grill, which blew my mind when I finally got out there to see it. Dan saw it earlier than I did because he was nearby. I can't believe he didn't run screaming the first day that he came back. Wait, we're doing this there. This is what's happening. So at that point, I would say there was a feeling in the air, and Dan spoke to this almost immediately, that we were building something cool. Right, you could almost feel it. It was tangible when you walked into the office. That no one thought we're here and we're staying here. It was we're here and we're growing, and that was immediate, and it was felt across the board. But early days, we were I don't know, damn it, 30,000 meals or something like that. Was one of the first couple of weeks. I remember that number sticking out in my head, and no one knew how many meals could even be produced in that building or what efficiencies we can gain. I remember there was one trip out to Arizona, and Mike came on that trip, and he was getting to see the CX office and meet Dan and meet the whole team. And I remember standing next to Mike in the office, and I was like, "What do we think the capacity is? Like, where are we growing to?" And he was like, "I don't know. 100,000 meals would be great out of that kitchen." I was like, really? And we wound up getting 350,000 meals out of that one kitchen, and then adding numbers of other kitchens where we were doing over 1 million meals a week, which is crazy. But like even at that point, Mike's dream was 100,000. But yeah, our first couple weeks there, months there, we were nowhere near that, and there was no guarantee we were going to get there. But everybody felt like we were.
Yeah.
I think part of the reason I didn't go running for the hills was I had the opportunity to meet Alejandro, who's one of the brilliant managers, maybe director now at the facility. And like it was very clear to me that he knew what was going on. He knew everybody there. He knew everything that was happening. He knew every piece of equipment. He knew it all, right? And he told us very early on that the maximum capacity that we could ever get out of that kitchen was going to be 260,000 meals, if I remember correctly, even though we weren't anywhere close. And I was like, okay, well, if we're sending out 260,000 meals a week, that's a pretty decent customer base. Let's just see how this goes. And then, of course, we get up to over 1 million meals a week in a couple of years, and it was just incredible.
And for anyone watching that doesn't know, so Freshly was creating fresh meals and delivering them straight to your door. They were one of the pioneers to do that. And it's hilarious to think, we think of startup pain so much in software of trying to scrap together pieces of your infrastructure, getting stuff out the door and a great onboarding experience for your clients and working like crazy behind the scenes. But the grill example is spot on. It's like you've got this one grill that you can put, like Mike said, 100,000 meals, and you do it right, and you're 350,000 meals, but you've got the team to come together and make that happen. So that's a funny story. Yeah.
To give a little more context on Freshly, because I know we sort of skipped over that, there were companies like HelloFresh and Blue Apron out there, and they were shipping ingredients in the box with a card of telling you how to go and cook it. And that seemed to be the model that everybody was doing. That was like the food tech, right? There were very few doing fully prepared meals that were ready to heat and eat, not frozen, sent fresh to your doorstep. The logistical challenges that went into that, to say that once this meal is cooked, we only have 60 hours from this point. Colin is here.
Colin is here.
Yeah, we only have 60 hours from this point to get that meal to your doorstep. You can imagine how difficult that is when you're sending meals in the mail through FedEx, and all the things that can go wrong that then wind up on the CX team. So yeah, good point to bring in context about Freshly here.
Yeah. Colin, quick intro. Colin's jet lagged, flight delayed, but he's here. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Colin. I'm currently a CX advisor at Freshworks, but yes, my background is in the contact center space. So for the past, almost 15 years now, I spent my time heading CX at various companies. I headed a specialized customer support team at the company Ticket Network for about 6 years, which is like the main competitor to StubHub in the event entertainment ticketing space. Spent 6 years at Freshly, leading the CX team there, where I met Ben and Dan. Spent some time heading CX more briefly at the fintech company Albert. Now, like I said, I'm with Freshworks, a software company. So I've kind of gone over to the vendor side of things a little bit, and I'm channeling my knowledge and using it in different ways to help out our own customers when it comes to their own CX-related strategies.
That's right. And Colin has known Dan the longest. So Dan is now bald, and he's known Ben the second longest, and Ben's on the way. So soon I'll be there too. I'm still working it though.
I had that effect on people.
So Colin, you came on and you hired both. We talked a lot before you came about Ben and Dan and hired them. When you did that, like, what were you looking to accomplish with them? Were there certain metrics that were top of mind? You were scaling an organization. How did you do that seamlessly and grow a team and train them while continuing to deliver best-in-class customer experience? I think that's something a lot of people struggle with all the time.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, especially as there are very rising demands from really everyone. So when you think about it, your customers have rising demands. the agents under you have higher expectations and demands. You're dealing with probably a C-suite that has higher expectations and demands. It's kind of balancing out all those things. And I think the big challenge is how do you scale cost effectively and efficiently while at the same time not sacrificing quality. And that's really the key thing. I think a lot of people are a bit scarred by the more traditional call center experience. And I was in one of those earlier in my experience, where it's all about answering the phone call and getting the customer off the phone and how many calls you take an hour and that sort of thing. And quality was kind of a secondary, or not even a secondary characteristic. So if it was secondary characteristic, that was a good day. And everything was sacrificed for efficiency. And I think nowadays people understand that you have to balance out both quality and efficiency, and that's really the challenge that CX leaders have to encounter. My experience looking back on the whole Freshly experience, there were a few things. The first thing, and it sounds very basic at its core, but it really comes down to hiring the right people. So I think we were not very stereotypical in how we hired people. And this is a broad week, because Ben and Dan were very intimately involved in this as well, and actually did a lot more direct hiring later on than even I did. But we put a big emphasis on hiring the right people. So you need to hire people who are willing to go through that challenging experience where you're scaling up an organization very fast, because that takes a certain type of person who can withstand that pace and at the same time stay positive, and people who also are dedicated to quality, who are really going to care about that as you grow the organization. And because you're scaling fast, it's inevitable that someone you hire today as a frontline agent, in 6 months or even less, they could even move into a new position, or you may have need of that person to do other things of a more leadership capacity. So you also have to hire people who you can move into those positions, because if you're spending all your time managing all the specifics and the details, it doesn't give you any opportunity to strategize at all. So you really have to hire good people, good frontliners, and you have to hire really, really good managers too, to kind of set that cultural tone. I think another thing you need to do is really focus on infrastructure. So there's a whole analogy about you have to build the plane as you fly it and that sort of thing, which I think is really apt. And I would just add a third component to that, which is you have to build the plane while you're flying it, and you have to write the manual at the same time. So if you add in the third component, it's the manual, where you're kind of building up the infrastructure. So you're also saying, here are the SOPs we're creating out of the process of building the plane. They may not be perfect the first time around, but you're building out a process that can be followed by other people. So it's not just a flash in the pan and not just about getting over the hump today. And I think that's the key. So really building up that infrastructure as you're going along, being very conscious of creating it. And that allows you to be much smarter when it comes to scaling, because you're not just, again, dealing with the momentary realities, but you're also building for the future. The very last thing I would say is, and what we did really early on, is establish a quality assurance program, which was really, really important. And mainly because it was established so early on, which I think is kind of unusual, because almost every customer support team I've ever encountered establishes quality assurance programs that are relatively robust. So you have some sort of defined rubric, and you have some process around it, and you get scores out of it, and you apply those scores to how you're evaluating your agents and so forth. But a lot of organizations don't even think about a quality assurance program until they're very, very good size. And I see this, in all honesty, among customers I deal with in the Freshworks context, where you don't see many companies, and even larger ones, have a quality assurance program until they notice there's a diminution of quality because the organization's gotten so large, and you're kind of playing catch up. But doing that very, very early is good, because that way, not only does it help your training program, because you're defining what quality is, but it also means that as you're scaling the organization, you have a way for evaluating quality and elevating people who deliver good quality. And so it's not all based on how fast someone is responding. The last thing I'll throw in there is like KPIs. So you need to have defined KPIs, is really important too. So everyone knows kind of where they stand and things, and they know their place in the organization and where they fit into that. And you can motivate people through that and recognize them through that. So you really need a defined way of being able to evaluate how people are doing. And through that, you're evaluating how you're doing, and you can set clear goals for yourself.
I would like to chime in for just a moment. You noticed the fully thought out response that he provided for you there, right? Imagine getting that in an email, all right? Because Colin was the master of composing emails that were like, novels, right? And so when you came into work, if you didn't have one of those, something was wrong, right? So it's just the thoroughness of how he thinks about things was always evident for us, right? And it gave us not just a clear path on what we needed to do, but how we needed to think about certain things, right? So I think that was just brilliantly explained there.
Yeah, I mean, the strongest leaders I've worked with and that I've met, especially in this space, clearly articulate what they're trying to do, both short term and long term. And when everybody is rowing in the same direction, it becomes fun doing it because people aren't blaming and doing this and that. It's more, hey, like here's where we're all going together and we're all brought in. We're going to put our egos aside and do that. And that's a really good point of like, how do you communicate that? And as this organization gets larger and larger, to have it written on paper where people can reference back to it, add it into their OKRs, whatever it might be, is a very compelling thing. So we have some questions coming in, but one thing that Colin, you brought up about, you mentioned a lot. So I hope everyone had their notebooks out. This is being recorded. Well, we can reference back to it. But KPIs and looking and tracking at metrics. Before you hired Dan and Ben, how did you get leadership involved to look at CX in the right lens to say this is what we're going to invest in? And did you have metrics that are separate from leadership versus your internal team? How did that whole dynamic work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say that there was core agreement on certain overarching metrics. So there was a bit of a distinction where when it came to the overarching team, there were certain key metrics that represented key areas. So like, for instance, you can have all different types of efficiency related metrics, but for email, and this is pretty classic across the board anyway, like you're typically looking at like average response time or average first response time or something like that. So I would say that when it came to the C-suite view, the idea was finding what are some of those key metrics and elevating those. And also making sure you're balancing that out so you have a quality component and an efficiency component too. So again, you're making sure that you're tracking both those things and you're shining light on those throughout the rest of the organization. So like customer satisfaction scores were big because we always had surveys, and that was before we had a quality assurance program. Those were the ways that we understood the quality that we were delivering to customers through their own perspective. And then when it came to efficiency, it varied by channel because every channel is different. I mean, we were very email dominant early on, like a lot of companies back 6-7 years ago or so. So we were looking at like average response time. And those are the types of metrics that were kind of reported up, along with just basic volume metrics to understand how many contacts are coming in and so forth. So those are some of the key metrics reported up to the C-suite. And then when it came to individuals, they were a little bit more granular. And this is something where I think you can take different takes on it. And we were probably more complex in this than other organizations are, but we had like 3 efficiency metrics rolled into one, which we use to evaluate our agents. And part of that was to make sure there was a holistic approach to efficiency, because sometimes certain metrics can incentivize bad behavior if they're taken in isolation, right? So for instance, you have a lot of companies that will track the number of tickets per hour or emails per hour or something like that, which makes sense because you get a sort of utilization out of that. But the problem with that is you're not necessarily tracking quality inherent in that metric. And you also want to make sure that you're incentivizing people to deliver good quality. So if you're solely tracking something which is about how fast you are, how many contacts you're processing through, those may not be the best metrics. Or you may have someone who is kind of self-selecting certain types of contacts that are easier to answer to the detriment of other people if you have more of like an open inbox system. So if you have different types of metrics, you can try to get around how people may try to get around the system, essentially. So for like email, we evaluated average email response time as like the core metric. And then in addition to that, and it kind of varied at various points, but you can also measure simultaneously the number of emails. And we also measured, like for instance, you may want to measure the difference between average first response time and the overall average response time, because you may want to put special emphasis on how quickly an agent is responding to customers in the first interaction, because that has more impression. Because it's the first instance that a customer is having about engaging with a company. So you may want to track that separately, because you could otherwise have a system where someone is overarchingly good with their email response time back and forth, but they may not be giving those customers the best service when it comes to that first response. Well, another thing we also did is have what's called like a violation percentage, which is like an inversion of what you typically see with the SLA percentage. So you set some sort of service level across your emails, your contacts, and you look at the percentage of times an agent is hitting that service level. And that's useful, especially if you have varying standards in terms of responsiveness. So you may have different response times for a lower priority email versus a higher priority, which isn't really encapsulated by looking at an average response time. So the SLA can kind of bake that in. So the violation percentage was like an inverse of that. And it looked at a certain threshold above which we would consider a response time egregious, and calculate the percentage of times that a given agent was engaging in contacts and their average response time was above that egregious level. And then again, that was kind of designed to make sure that when we're calculating these median averages all over the place, where there's the possibility that there are some outliers that are really bad experiences for customers, that we're also tracking those outliers and making sure they don't go past a certain level. And again, it's all part of making sure that we're looking granularly at the agent experience and trying to account for all possibilities.
So you're tracking all that, Ben. So we have two questions. One from Nicholas, which I want to get to in a second. It's a really good one. And he compliments Ben on his glasses, which don't get Ben started. He goes off on that. But Jessica Rose poses a good question. Ben, you're in New York. You're in the thick of it. She asks, what tools would you utilize to track quality overall? But to take it a step further, how did you also implement that? Like, so you can track it, but how did you give that feedback to agents? And how did you let them know the job they're doing, but also how they could improve?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because when we started this, and Colin mentioned, having a quality assurance program so early on, there really weren't a lot of tools out there at that point. Right. So originally it was like SurveyMonkey and Google Sheets that you tried to figure out how many different emails or how many different phone calls you had to, QA for which agent, and hopefully not cross over each other, right? Because originally it would just be like one grader, but once there was more than one grader, I don't want to, QA the same ticket twice. And so we would try to mark those in a Google Sheet and then actually process the QA rubric in SurveyMonkey. I actually remember one of the first Zendesk conferences we went to where we saw a Maestro QA booth in the back, and they were first pitching this new tool. And then Vasu, the founder of Maestro, came to the office and was pitching this as something he was looking for feedback on. It was not fully out in the market yet. And early on, we moved over from SurveyMonkey to Maestro QA, used that tool for a while, had a great experience for a number of years, then switched over to Playvox. And at Pair Eyewear now, again, I'm back with Maestro QA. So I've seen a few out there. There's others like Klaus. I'm a fan of Maestro QA today. And it's definitely helped. And I've seen it go from a very, very small team with just, one or two graders to a world where you have, almost 20 plus graders and, an appeals process built into it and a way to sort of annotate on a ticket right next to a grade and then share that out via PDFs with the agents, or even have the agents logging into Maestro to really play with their feedback. It depends how robust you want to be, but those tools are out there, and I'll just say Maestro QA is my favorite today.
So then take it to the next step. How did you, obviously that feedback is there, but it's a delicate thing to say to some, here's what's going on and here's how we need you to get better without hurting morale, because they're customer facing and they have to be on their best on the phones and over email and explain that tone, as we talked about CXEX. How did you bridge that gap?
Yes, in the long run at Freshly, at one point in there, I was manager of QA. So I just handled that part of the business. So it is near and dear to my heart. So I will say that the initial thought is that, that's going to be hard to take that hard feedback. What I think goes into you thinking that way is that these aren't consistent conversations. I only hear from you when it's negative. That's not true in a good QA program. We're having these conversations every week, and one bad week is not going to result in you being terminated, right? We're going to see how we can improve for next week. So that's the tone of the conversation. And second, if you have, a really good tool like Maestro in place where you're not just saying yes, no to certain questions, you're saying no because right here, let me highlight it for you. and say, here's why you're getting a no on this question, it sort of removes the thought of, well, I got this because that guy didn't like me. The grader just doesn't like me. That's out the window when you have to show your work, right? Like, why am I giving this person a no for this answer? And I have to give commentary on it. And if and when you do disagree, having an appeals process in place makes those conversations really great, right? So when I sit down with someone and I say, hey, look, you had a really rough week last week. You had 5 auto fails, and here's why they were auto failed. I'm coming with data, right? I'm not just saying this. I'm going to show them. We're going to look over these together. We're going to spend time talking about it. We're going to say, how can we get better from here? And it's not like you're fired today over it. So those conversations don't wind up being all that negative, actually.
So hearing Colin, or actually Dan, talked about Colin's memoirs of emails and the way that you handle QA, it's the consistency. When from a leadership perspective, being consistent and setting expectations with the employees of here's what you can expect from me and here's what I expect from you seems to be the path forward that works the best, where we're going to get together all the time. And sometimes it might be something to improve upon. Other times it's going to be praising you, but I'm not going to be an unfamiliar face. I'm going to be somebody that you want to work with and you want to get better with. The next so there's 2 questions that also came up in the comments here, and thank you for all these. Please keep posting these. The closer I get to the mic, the more I sound like a podcaster. Nicholas talked about how can CX partner with the broader organization to discuss voice of the customer and share it. And Alexandra brings up another good point to dovetail that is good managers driving overall CX and company morale. How do you deliver that customer first mindset across the org outside of your direct department? So I know that's kind of a loaded question. Let's start with voice of the customer, as Nicholas asked that a while ago.
I sort of see them as both the same, and how we would approach it is sort of similar too. So like early days, freshly, there would be like a Monday morning stand up where the whole company would be in one room. We'd all stand together. And one of the things that we got to do early on, Colin and I, was go through some of the comments from the previous week and pick like 2 really great positive ones and 2 challenges, 2 things that were not doing so well. And we would get up and we would speak that to the whole company. So they were hearing directly from us, not some email, not in writing. You were going to have to sit through every Monday morning, Colin standing up there and saying, I got my meals and they were really, really bad. And here's why, and here's how delayed they were, and blah, blah, blah. And that really helped, because almost at the end of all those meetings, someone would come up to us and say, tell me more about that. What happened there? Can I get more information around that? Are you seeing more of those? And so we would try to pick, 1 comment or 2 that are representative of a whole bunch more. And hopefully that would gain interest.
Yep.
I then had this thought at some point. It was hard to really effectuate, but I tried to reach out to customers who had left those written comments and asked if they would record a video of themselves saying what they said in the comment. And then I would show that in the Monday meeting instead of Colin and I reading it. And we did that for a few weeks. It was hard to manage to get people to actually record the video and the logistics of playing the video in that meeting room. But I think that helped too, because almost every time we would get comments after that of, oh, now I remember Rose, who looks like this, who was wearing that piece of clothing, really had a rough time with that meal. Like, now I'm connected to her. So that's my 2 cents on how I've been able to do it in the past and how I continue to try to get that done.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say I think one of the key things about voice of the customer programs is they have to be holistic. So you'll find some organizations that may use voice of the customer and kind of shorthand for things like surveys. But really the idea is that a real voice of the customer program has to be pretty all-encompassing, because there are different ways your customers speak to you. And sometimes they may speak to you by proxy as well. So really what you need is the ability to be able to take all these disparate pieces of data and knit them together. And this is actually a great use of a CX organization, really, because CX kind of sits at that nexus and engages with customers the most. So it's a great role for a CX leader to add more prominence to his or her organization or his or her own role in the organization, because chances are you have access to more of this data than anyone else. But you really want to look at like different ways you get data. So surveys obviously are one way that you get data from customers. And then you may have areas of behavioral data So maybe there are various ways you're tracking the behavior of customers as to how they interact with your website, or how often they contact customer support. Could be another example. So even just within customer support, there's a lot of behavioral data there. And then you look at other areas as well. So the reasons customers contact you are one thing. So let's say you have an automatic contact tagging system that you can use that's AI powered, that automatically tags your incoming contacts. You get a sense for why customers are contacting you or what their sentiment may be. And then the other thing is also using the people internally in your organization, like your agents, and using them as proxies for the voice of the customer, because they know probably more than anyone else because they're dealing with customers all day long. But a lot of organizations don't necessarily consult their agents so much. So those are another source of voice of the customer. And Ben led a lot of those efforts when he was at Freshly, serving as our liaison with teams like product and engineering and so forth. So having someone who can kind of serve as the voice of the customer through their inherent knowledge and bring that to the rest of the organization. So I think the key is you have to find all the different ways you can track voice of the customer, make sure they're coming into some sort of single source that can take that information and do something with it and disseminate it. And then, like Ben was saying, finding different ways to do that. So it's not all about reports, but you find ways to really make it meaningful. And those customer videos that Ben was talking about were definitely really meaningful, and you could tell that it stuck with people and had an impact. So yeah, it's about unifying it, all that information, and also just making sure you have opportunities to collect it. So the idea of having like an AI contact tagging program is an example of you having to go out and get a system that will help to get you data you wouldn't naturally have. So you have to find ways of getting the data, then you need to find ways of organizing it, and then you need to find ways of disseminating it. And that's a great role for a CX leader that can really raise your profile and the profile of your organization, because you're really the gatekeeper in many respects to that information.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to it too is, whenever I hear some senior leader at the company saying that we need to spend money to go out to do some survey or some user study, my first response back is, have you talked to the agents yet? Do you have a CX team here? Maybe start right there. And see what insight they can help give to you.
So the video thing is obviously fascinating to me. You can think why. Did you find with that, one, talk to me about the empowerment that you had mentioned about the video versus text and why that was, but also when you reached out to the clients and they had the chance to feel heard and send the video across, did that change anything? Like if it was a negative review and they were able to put it into a video, did that change like their loyalty? Did they feel like they're a part of Freshly in some way?
Yeah, so I'll give my answer there, because I was the guy who talked to them. I was the one asking for the videos and then had to deal with them after the fact. A lot of times, yeah, they felt really heard and they felt like they had a piece of this company now. Sometimes that was good, sometimes that wasn't, where they now thought they had direct access to me and they were like, well, you care so much. My box this week was late too. What are you doing about that? And now I have to handle this particular person's issue, and you can't really get away from them after you ask for the video. Yeah. So there's that part of it too, but they definitely felt as if they were being heard. And I think even in the situations that were more negative, it was overall a positive that we reached out and that they felt like they could not just write a comment in that maybe would get read, maybe wouldn't. When they knew the whole company was going to see their 30-second, 1-minute video, they almost got excited about it, because there hasn't been another avenue like that where they thought that they could voice their issue, which of course is very important to them. Their box being late is the most important thing in the world, in their world, and get that across to the whole company. That was an exciting thing for most of those users, and they wound up being thankful that I reached out.
Yeah. And the impact of sharing it with the org, text versus video, like what were some ahas you had with that as well?
I think the commentary afterward, right? If we got one or two that came up to us after a meeting where Colin and I did a reading, that was good. On the videos, it was more so the Slacks that I got afterwards, where they would Slack me and be like, can you send me that video? Like, do you have it? I want to rewatch that. No one ever said, hey, can you send me the comment that Colin read this morning? The video they wanted to see again and again, or they wanted to share it around their team and show people because it was something that they did wrong. And that made it a lot more usable, shareable. And we had a channel for like delighted NPS, all the detractors to come in, whole company could see it. But I don't know how many people actually were reading it. It does become sort of noise after it, and you don't really get in touch with that person if you're not seeing them and hearing their voice. So I think that was the most impactful voice of customer thing that we did in our time there.
So the whole thing about consumer sentiment, like this is a very hot topic in the industry. Everybody's trying to measure that voice of the customer. When you think about the emails that come in, like you just said, Colin reads it. It's not really what you say; it's how you say it. So, how do the three of you? I mean, whether it's Freshly or where you are now, how do you look at consumer sentiment, and how do you get the most out of the text?
I don't know. Dan, you want to go, or Colin, you want to go? I feel like I've been talking too much.
Me too.
Well, I'm going to say it's well, there are different ways you can do that. So obviously you can use tools. So you can use like text-based analysis tools, which are increasingly becoming popular in order to look at mass content and extract patterns in that. So I think on a large scale level, that's basically what you have to do. But otherwise, it's kind of coming down to being able to find some way to organize the content you're receiving, whichever form you're receiving it, is the main thing. And there are different ways you can do that, but you need to make it palatable. So you need to be able to organize the content, and then you need to be able to make sure it's going to the right people. So like Ben was saying, in a format that's very shareable, when you identify a piece of feedback, especially relevant for a certain team in operations or engineering or product or something like that, then you need to make sure you have mechanisms for delivering that to the right people. So I think the meaningfulness you get out of it is the ability where you can have an overarching report to understand sentiment, especially when it comes to trends. So that, I would say, that's another thing. So not just about what the sentiment is now, but where it used to be. Because sometimes when you're identifying areas of concern, it's not necessarily a matter of what percentage does this sentiment make up in your current engagement with customers, but it's how does that compare with the past, and is there a trend upwards, and is that trend troubling? So having some historical awareness, but having that tool overarchingly to be able to look at your data across the board, and then making sure you have mechanisms for being able to get examples of that sentiment in a palatable way and distribute that to the right people in the organization so the right people get access to that information. So on a broad level, I think that's kind of what makes that more palatable.
We actually had a couple of different meetings where we would share some of that sentiment, especially the trends, right? We would look at them and put the not just put them up there where they could be seen, right? But actually read those out, right? Because there's a difference between having the information there and seeing it and having it actually read to you. Yes, it feels somewhat, elementary, but I think it is that much more impactful when somebody's reading it with the intent that it was sent by from that customer, right? And so when we had those, we would have those meetings. And then we would read out some of these comments like that. Inevitably, after every meeting, someone would say, "Hey, can you send me this slide, or can you send me that comment, or can you send me this?" Because they wanted to go do some more research on it. Because if you just stick something into a Slack, or you just stick something onto like an intranet site or something to that effect, are people going to look at it? Maybe, right? But if you're forcing them to actually hear the information, and you're like putting it on them and their teams, especially when it does, actually touch something that their team is affected by, then it's different.
Yeah. I mean, how impactful is that when a team works on a project so hard and it's so easy to move on to the next thing, but then when your team comes back and says, "Look at this video that the customer sent in on how much better this experience is because of your hard work." I mean, that's the most fulfilling thing. That brings up the other question. You keep talking about working cross-departmentally. Was that an initiative from the CX side of the org? Was that an initiative from leadership, or how did that all even start? Because I know some organizations are very siloed, and it can hurt. Where, like you said, you're the ones talking to the customers. How do you get that buy-in from the other departments?
So you guys may have more to say, but I have a very specific memory that's like stuck in my mind about this. Because like I said, back to the early conversation about like the superpower of not being a contact center guy, I wasn't bringing any of that to it. I'd never worked in a startup either, right? I worked at sports entertainment venues. I remember sitting on the the floor in New York and hearing a call come in from a customer, and the customer was talking about a marketing promotion that they got an email about. And the agent was adamant saying, no, you're wrong. That's not a marketing promotion that's going on right now. And the customer was saying, yeah, I have it. It's right here. And I just thought it was crazy that something from marketing had gone out to customers that the agents weren't well aware of first, and that we would be, blindsided by a customer contact and make us look silly. So maybe that was the first time of many where I just got up and walked over to marketing guy. And I was like, what's going on? What's happening? Why didn't we know this? And I started a weekly one-on-one with the guy who was in charge of marketing at the time, when we were all really small in one office space. And it started to feel like there needed to be communication between almost every department and CX. If a meal changed, we needed to know about it. If there was a delay at the facility, we needed to know about it. If a marketing promotion went out, that was us, right? If there's a change to the website, that's us. So really, that sucks for all the other teams, right? To feel like, oh, we always have to go and check in with CX and tell them what we're doing. Like, we move fast. We don't have time to go and check in. So we wound up trying to, create these bridges to ensure that there was, not a lot of onus put on those departments, but when things changed, we were alerted to it in enough time that the CX team would be aware of it, so that if we were on a call, we would never be blindsided like that again. And I think that, that's not new, but that's my experience with it. And it was new to me.
Yeah, I'd say the key thing is, it's not like with the voice of the customer stuff, is that you have to be mindful about engaging with other teams. And it was definitely easier earlier in the startup environment, pre-COVID, where everyone's on the same floor together and what have you. But, when everyone is separated, either geographically or organizationally, more and more as teams grow and teams huddle with themselves and they don't communicate as much with the rest of the organization and that sort of thing, you have to be mindful about making connections. It's sort of the same way now. People are more appreciative of the fact that you have to be mindful about agent morale and agent culture, because you just can't take it for granted that you can walk around the floor and understand how people are feeling just by seeing how they interact with others. And you have to institute mechanisms to track how people are feeling, and maybe surveys or different cultural events or institutionalized opportunities for people to connect and that sort of thing. So I'd say the same thing is true when it comes to interdepartmental collaboration. And Ben actually was the major person handling this, even in the latter stages of Freshly, when we were much more balkanized and siloed, where he was our liaison with the product team and the engineering team. So he was that person who could communicate our needs as an organization to them and our voice to those organizations. And he did it very, very effectively, and had a lot of good allies in there. And he was included in a lot of their regular weekly meetings as an example. So he was kind of inculcated in their processes. And then we also tried to do more where we're involving agents as well in that process. So he ran a process where some agents were involved in some product level discussions. So we give agents the opportunity to raise their hand and volunteer themselves for adding in their 2 cents on a regular basis, usually on with a quarterly time frame, where they could join some of these product meetings or test out some upcoming product launches before they launch live. And provide that voice. And these were all programs that were trying to institutionalize. And you see other companies do things like, everyone has to go through CX training as an example. So you see that at some companies as a way to kind of institutionalize collaboration from early on. Or another thing we used at Freshly, which was more widespread, is like a pod concept for a period of time, where you would break up the customer experience in different key touch points, let's say, and you would have a pod on that experience. And it's a cross-functional pod where you inherently had someone from product and engineering and CX and marketing and what have you. So I think the key thing is you need to find ways to institutionalize, ultimately, cross-collaboration in your organization. So like with the infrastructure building, it just becomes part of the way you do business. And you can incentivize, like in the performance review process, you can bring in incentives when it comes to being cross-collaborative in the values you represent as a company, and what cultural rubric you use, where you could rank collaboration, let's say, very highly, at least have some way of rating people according to that.
Like, if I can just add on,
Yeah.
when all of that doesn't work, right? If you try to put all these things in place and all of it doesn't work, having managers who will go out to these other teams, right, and intimidate them for not providing us any of this information, right? And those teams realizing that if I don't get this to our customer experience team before we send this out, or before we do this, or before we implement this thing, I know I'm going to hear from blank, right?
Right.
That was also something that we used very, very well. My team specifically used that very well.
So there's two things that follow up right on that, and we're coming up at time. I think there's 5 minutes left. And thank you for everyone, staying on amongst the technical difficulties. Nicholas brings up, I guess for you, Ben, have you seen good examples of how an organization shares out launches within the org? And he mentions he already gets a ton of emails. So how do you prioritize that or do it in a different way?
Yeah, so I mean, the easy answer is email, and I think product putting out like a good weekly email of like what's coming up, what's looking to be coming out soon, what actually launched this week, all that is still good to have. But he's right, we see open rates on those emails not all that high.
Yeah.
And we do get too many emails. I think having a key relationship where like product can give the information in a meeting setting to one person from CX, and letting that person distill it in the ways that work for the organization makes sense, or the department. So like in our world, we wound up having like a community manager who would be in charge of what announcements go out, when those announcements happen, like what channels do they actually go out on, to actually hit everybody in the CX world appropriately. And it's not just another email, it's a Slack, it's a mention in some daily shift memo potentially. What rises to the level of each, what gets the full treatment where it's going in all of them. Those decisions are made after we get the information from a product email, but that product email is not just going out to everyone, it's going to that connector, and then we determine how we're going to distill it out. We have tools like Lessonly. Like, does this constitute a whole new lesson being built because it's that big of a change? And then there's a whole list of announcements that go with a whole new lesson, and you have to take a lesson on it. You have to pass that test. So there's a lot that you could do if you have the infrastructure in place, and if you have that strong one-person connection to get relevant information in a timely manner. And that's the best way to do it if you do get too many emails, like clearly young Nicholas here does.
Was there anything with that where these are the methods that you think work, but again, because you developed that cross-departmental collaboration, is there ways you use solicit feedback to say, hey, this is how I'm trying to engage with you. Are there other ways you want me to do it?
Yeah, you do. But what I've seen work is if you show that person on the other end all the work that's going to happen on this end, if you just tell me the information, they feel a little bit of pressure there. And that's where Dan sort of got at some of this intimidation, right? I would show them a daily shift memo, what our Slack announcements look like, what Lessonly looks like. And I'd let them know, like, hey, if you're going to be putting out some new bit of information, here's what's going to happen with that on my end. And all of this relies on you telling me relevant information in real time. Yeah. And so then they wind up feeling this pressure to come and tell you the right things at the right time because they know what's going to happen on the back end, and they don't feel the pressure. Just like, oh, I don't want to do all that. I'll just tell you this and you go figure out the rest. And they feel like we're letting them off the hook and they're getting us good information in real time.
Good. Yeah, it's give and take, setting expectations.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add into that, because I thought Ben made really, really good points there. And the only thing I'd add to that too is it kind of comes back to the theme of being mindful about things again and kind of institutionalizing processes. And the other thing is that as we institutionalize some of these things he mentioned, we also put in tracking mechanisms. So not just kind of doing all these things and having process, but also understanding how can we actually track success in the same way that when you engage with customers, you track how you engage them. So no one sends off a bunch of emails to customers and doesn't care about open rates like Ben mentioned. But there are a lot of companies who do that with employees, where you may have all these emails you're sending employees, but you don't have any metrics to track how successful those communications are. How many people are opening the emails, or how many people are clicking on the emails, or if you have Slack channels, how many people are engaging them and at what rate, things of that nature. So when you're institutionalizing some processes, it's kind of mindful to think about what ways do you have where you can track success, create some metric around defining success. Even sometimes if it could be like quarterly surveys and just trying to get feedback from people on the ground as to, which communications do you find helpful and which don't you find helpful and why. But having something in there So you're just making sure that you're setting standards for yourself. And once you find good standards, then you can set goals as you progress and chart improvements. So you actually know you're at the very least heading in the right direction, and your communication is getting cleaner, and more people are reading it, and more people are engaging with it, and so forth.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Putting a process into place, but then getting feedback, having no ego, and adapting to that is crucial to getting everybody on board. There's other questions and comments that came through that are really good ones. We can follow up separately afterwards. I know we're at time. In the last 30 seconds, you worked at a food delivery startup. What were some of the weirdest things that came through on the CX side as it relates to food, anger, anything, any tickets that came through?
There's a lot.
I think one of the most memorable ones on our side was when Mike, our CEO, came to our office in Phoenix and decided to actually take a phone call.
Yep.
That did not go well. He was a perfect example of how not to handle a customer interaction. So I think that's probably the best one, at least from my point of view.
I saw a comment that said grill knobs. I was thinking about grill knobs. I'll go with Sharpie Gate. Finding the Sharpie. There were an accidental drop of a Sharpie that went through the vegetable cutter, and we found all the pieces of the Sharpie in multiple meals. That happened.
Okay.
Wow. Yes, that was Lisa's call. Colin, what do you got? I know we have a lot.
I was thinking of the whispering customer.
Oh,
Michael on the phone.
that's right.
Customer who just whispered,
Are you real? I remember it.
Some horror movie.
Yeah, it sounds like The Exorcist. That's odd. Look, I know we have to jump off. Thank you all. It's been the first episode. It was a great one. There's more we could definitely talk about. Again, sponsored by Hark. Please reach out if any questions on that. And yeah, we're going to end it now. We'll share this out for a replay if you need any of it. Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Ben. And thanks, Dan, for joining.
Of course. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
All right.